Elizabeth Warren announced a fantastic piece of legislation that she calls the Anti-Corruption and Public Integrity Act. So let's watch here. She's on Rebel headquarters. She's going to break down the different provisions. And then I'll explain to you how this could have gotten more legs.
So the first one, padlock the revolving door. The idea here is that these folks serve on Wall Street, they get big salaries, and then they just pass their way through over to government where they actually regulate exactly the same folks that they used to work for and will probably work for again. So this one has a lot of features in it, and we'll go back to any of these you want, that say we're going to padlock the revolving door. The second one, stop the self-dealing by public officials. This one ought to be pretty obvious, but if you are a public official, like a senator or maybe the head of one of these agencies, you should not own individual stocks. You should not be trading in individual stocks. Index funds, fine, that are across a broad market. But the decisions you should be making should be decisions that are clearly about the best interests of the country, not your own best interests. And by the way, that means people like, for example, presidents of the United States should not own outside businesses. I mean, right now, if the Saudis want to put a little money in President Trump's pocket, they just take a whole floor over at the Trump Hotel. And does that work? Well, we don't know for sure because he didn't divest himself of his business ownership and he's never produced his tax returns. By the way, that's another feature of this one. It says you got to everybody who wants to run for public federal office has to be willing to put out there 8 years of federal tax returns. Third big one, in lobbying as we know it. And that means lobbyists can't make contributions to elected officials, but it also means the bigger pieces. The definition of lobbyist, if you're actually getting paid to go influence our federal government, then by golly, you got to register as a lobbyist. No more Swiss cheese hide behind maybe this piece and maybe that piece. We get everybody in and then a little transparency. Lobbyists want to meet with elected officials, fine. It has to be a public record of every single meeting. And if lobbyists give things to elected officials, I don't just mean gifts. I mean, they give them documents, studies, memos. All of that has to go in the public record and be put online, searchable immediately. Fourth big one, support our agencies that are trying to do rulemaking against corporate capture. So this is one that basically says when the lobbyists spend $1 bazillion to overwhelm an agency, how about we tax the lobbyists and put some of that money back into the agency so they actually have the resources to defend the public interest? This is also one that goes into studies, which I care a whole lot about, that you don't get to put out junk studies and push them out there without revealing who paid for them and who edited them. And by the way, if they don't meet basic scientific standards, then the agency tosses them out right from the beginning.
Right.
So the idea behind all of these are areas where there are problems, things we could do, and then the big one at the end is to say, I'm sorry, one more, courts. We can talk about that if you want. But the big one at the end is hire a new sheriff. A single agency that oversees ethics throughout the federal government. The House, the Senate, the White House, the administration, the regulatory agencies make sure everybody's filing their paperwork, everyone's putting their tax returns out there, and that no one is trading in stock and so on.
Right.
Actually enforce these rules. So that's the basic idea. What do you think?
So this piece of legislation is superb, but unfortunately it has like a negative 5% chance of passing today because Republicans control Congress, but it would even have, what, a 5% chance of passing when the Democrats get control, which, by the way, tells you everything you need to know about both parties in Washington, D.C., and how terrible the current state of events is. Now, having said that, I really like what Elizabeth Warren is doing here. This reminds me quite a bit of how she championed the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which returned billions of dollars to defrauded Americans, and she had to force the Obama administration to do it. So again, that's probably the biggest reason why I keep calling Elizabeth Warren the second best senator we have outside of Bernie Sanders. But here's one of the things about this that kind of gets under my skin, is that even when some Democrats mean well, they don't know what they're doing in terms of playing politics. So again, this piece of legislation is wonderful, but it's called the Anti-Corruption and Public Integrity Act. Now, that's fine and dandy in the sense that political wonks like myself will look at this and we'll cover it and we'll discuss it and we go, oh, this is great. But this is going to have no impact outside of progressive circles. Now, how can you make it so that it has impact out of progressive circles? Very simple. Elizabeth Warren should have named this bill the Drain the Swamp Act. And then she should have done this media tour that it seems like she's beginning right now. And the whole focus of the media tour should have been, on top of explaining the provisions, kind of like she just did, except I would sharpen that message a little bit where you can explain it in a more brief and punchy way, Elizabeth Warren, because not everybody has long attention spans and they're like gnats now. It's just they just lose focus immediately. So explain it in a more concise way, point number one. And then point number two is the whole focus should be, this is the Drain the Swamp Act of 2018, and President Donald Trump said he wants to drain the swamp. So obviously President Trump cannot wait to work with me to try to get this piece of legislation passed. I assume he will also be out here doing a media tour to push the Drain the Swamp Act, because this is the exact kind of thing that he campaigned on. That is how you have an impact. That is how you play politics. And then when you do that, instead of just TYT and Secular Talk and fucking Huffington Post covering this shit, what'll happen is you are then forcing the rest of the media to cover it. Because now you gave them an angle, and the angle is, holy shit, Elizabeth Warren is superbly trolling Donald Trump. And I think the thing that drives me crazy is there wasn't a single Democratic strategist in Washington, D.C. that even briefly considered this point that I'm making right now, which is call it the Drain the Swamp Act. None of them considered it. Didn't even occur to them. So why the fuck even have Democratic strategists if they don't come up with ideas like the one I just gave? And also, by the way, their whole point is to try to pull the Democrats further and further to the right and make them more corporatist and make them bigger warmongers. So why even have Democratic strategists? They get in the way. I think Elizabeth Warren's instincts are way better than any fucking strategist that she has working for her. So it's just a goddamn shame, because this is such a great piece of legislation, and this really does show that there are some examples in Washington, D.C. of some politicians fighting for you some of the time. But instead of highlighting that and really being able to put a focus on that, this will be a flicker, and nobody will talk about it outside of this week, and people will just yawn and say it's too wonky, and that's a shame, because I agree with every provision of that piece of legislation, and I really want this to have a bigger impact, but the only way you're going to make it have a bigger impact in today's shitty media environment is to give people an angle, and the way to give people an angle is to troll the shit out of Trump and say this is the Drain the Swamp Act, so I expect you to sign up to it tomorrow, and if you don't, then you have to explain to the American people why you now love the swamp.